I'm good, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to the Peter Tali Coleman Lecture. We're very pleased to offer this lecture. We try to do it every year, and we're in the process of moving it from being an occasional lecture to being an annual lecture, and we're pleased to do that. We've had in the past the honor of having such speakers as the past president of Palau, Tami Ramengesau. We've had Prime Minister Fiame from Samoa, and a host of other Pacific Island leaders. And we're just so pleased to have the support of the Rattawagan family. And Fred and Amata, I want to thank you so much for your support and your leadership in this program. But I don't want to take too much of your time because really the stars of the show are here. And first, I'd like to invite my friend Amata Rattawagan, Congresswoman from American Samoa, who could introduce the Peter Tali Coleman Lecture and our speaker this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay.
Seems like it.
Talofa lava. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for the Peter Tali Coleman Lecture. I've introduced speakers for this lecture in prior years, but this time I get to introduce my friend and colleague, Congressman Dr. Neal Dunn. He is just a super guy. He represents the 2nd District of Florida, but he has a special heart for the well-being of the Pacific region, rooted in his time and experience there serving our great country in the military. You see, Dr. Dunn has worn more than one uniform. The uniform of the United States Army, the white coat of a medical doctor and longtime surgeon, the lapel pin of a U.S. congressman, and served on business, bank, and healthcare boards. As a member of Congress, he serves on the oldest standing committee in the House, which has the largest legislative footprint of any committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee. As you would expect, Dr. Dunn serves on the Health Subcommittee, and he also serves on the Select Committee on the CCP, which you're likely to hear more about in his speech. I will close with one more detail. He and I traveled together in 2023 on a congressional delegation with that committee in the South Pacific. And we stopped in the Solomon Islands, which is the site of Guadalcanal, where we laid wreaths at the American War Memorial. In a special stop for me, we stopped at the Coast Watchers Memorial in Honiara. That brings us full circle to the namesake of this lecture, Peter Tali Coleman, who served in that campaign, assigned to the Navy, although he was in the Army, as an organizer and participant of these heroic Coast Watchers. I'm proud of his legacy, and I'm so grateful to Dr. Dunn for that opportunity, his friendship, and I appreciate him taking time from a busy week to be here to talk Pacific policy. Thank you, Dr. Dunn.
Hey, thank you. Well, good evening, and let me start with an apology for being a little bit late. And neither Amata nor I think, are honestly to blame for that. The voting in Congress is just what it is sometimes. But I hate to keep audiences waiting ever. I know when I was a surgeon, I was impatient if anybody ever kept me waiting. And by the way, it's a special honor to be here at a lecture named after Amata's father, Peter Coleman. And I was, as she mentioned, I was with her in Guadalcanal, and we went to the Coast Watchers Memorial. And by the way, it's a memorial to all the Coast Watchers, but he was the lead Coast Watcher. He was the guy who actually delivered all the different Coast Watchers around the islands there under the guise of being a copra trader, and he literally had a schooner, an old sailboat, wooden sailboat, and he was an intelligence officer in our Navy, and he's regarded as one of the greatest heroes of Guadalcanal. And so a real special honor for any military person to be at a lecture named after such an august personality. And it was a real pleasure to stand by your side when we laid a wreath there. That was great. Well, thank you so much also for Professor Tedwell for inviting me here. It's a meaningful lecture. I really look forward to this. I have spent time in the islands. I never thought all the time I spent there in the Army was going to amount to some of the things it has in my life, but I've met some wonderful people, including the gentleman sitting right behind him, Peter Watson, who's one of the most distinguished diplomats ever to serve in the Pacific. For anybody, we're very, very grateful for all the work that he's done over many years. I might have said that I represent, I'm in the Energy and Commerce Committee, Healthcare, and the CCP Committee, by the way, the Select Committee on CCP, that's the Chinese Communist Party. So we don't call it the Select Committee on China, call it on the Chinese Communist Party. We do not regard the Chinese people as adversaries, rather the party, if you will, that leads China. This has given me a lot of exposure to the Pacific at this point in my career. I guess I have a microphone. I don't need this thing, do I? Put that down. Sorry about that. I was just following a modest good example. I really thank everyone here for joining us this evening for this opportunity to recognize one of the most under-recognized and unique areas of the world, the Pacific Island nations, which has many, many cultures and wonderful people. I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes or so discussing what Congress is doing there and what we're doing to try to spur our engagement in that part of the world. And then I want to hear what you have to say. I want to hear your questions, your comments, what you're studying. I think it's important for us to know what you are, what you're learning, and also I fully anticipate that I'll learn from you as well. So please make note of any questions or comments that you have during the course of this, and we'll try to get to those afterwards. So let me say, Americans sort of tend to fly to these destinations for either humanitarian reasons, leisure, or other purposes in business. And albeit it has a very vibrant, remote culture, I think that people lose sight of the fact that they're situated across some of the busiest shipping channels in the world. And these are very, very vital to world trade. And they provide access not only through the South China Sea, but all of the east-west trade across, from the Americas to China and other nations there. And it's fair to say that this region has rather languished as a niche concern in the deliberations of our good friends in Foggy Bottom State Department for a number of years. But I will say that the awareness of this region of the world is becoming much, much more widely appreciated today, not only in America, but also in other places that we'll talk about in just a minute. And I have a slide, if you don't mind, who's controlling it? Just something to gaze on. When I'm going to get to this in more detail in a minute, but it helps to kind of reflect on what we're talking about when we talk about the Pacific Island nations. And so in Congress, we broadly mean the sovereign island nations, states, and dependent island territories within the broad groupings of Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia. However, honestly, an accurate description of the island nations of the Pacific would have to include an awful lot more countries and a lot more influence: Japan, Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines, Brunei. I mean, just a lot of places, and a lot of smaller atolls that almost nobody ever hears about or thinks about. In fact, interestingly, to this day, the sovereignty of several of the smaller atoll nations remains a matter of debate. I offer as an example Kapinga Marangi, which I happened to have a patient from there many years ago, and that's how I learned about the island. And it depends on what your sources are. It might be a part of Spain, it might be part of Micronesia, or it might be a totally sovereign nation. And in my brief dealings with them, I got the sense that they didn't know what they wanted to be either. So we're talking a very, very small population, rather isolated island, but it's not the only one out there, and this is an inhabited nation. So suffice it to say that at the end of World War II, there was a lot of confusion, a lot of distractions, and not just a little bit of ignorance in Washington, and that has bequeathed us some problems in the Pacific that remain with us to this day. For example, Bougainville and Papua New Guinea fought a 10-year civil war over sovereignty that left something like 20% of the nations dead. And despite a mutual agreement to allow sovereignty for Bougainville, a date still has not been set for that sovereignty. So there's some active discussions out there. I won't get into Western Papua New Guinea and Indonesia now, but it's another new sort of spark point out there, or a flashpoint out there in the Pacific. I think we should also mention here that the Indian Ocean nations, most particularly India itself, are critical to our geopolitical understanding and interests in the Pacific Ocean. So they can't be ignored when we're considering our strategic and economic concerns in the Pacific. We have to think about the Indian Ocean as well. And I want to present the first of a series of maps here of the Pacific nations. And this first map shows most of the Pacific Island nations, and the white you see around them are their exclusive economic zones. And that's area where they legally have control over the right of transit through those zones and the natural resources that exist in those zones, whether that be fish swimming in the sea or minerals and oil on the bottom of the ocean. So all of that establishes some important rights and control. These zones are meaningful only insofar as the respective nations can enforce them. And China runs rampant through most of them for fishing, intelligence operations, a variety of paramilitary and police actions as well. Very few of these countries have any naval presence needed to patrol and enforce their will over their own waters and territory, especially against China, which has the world's largest navy and the world's largest fishing fleet. And I would note here that their fishing fleets are very highly militarized. So quite honestly, China tends to forcibly seize the fishing resources of nations throughout the world that don't have naval capability to protect them. And we hear this all the time in Washington from all the world's island nations, plus the coastal nations of Africa, Asia, and South America. The Chinese are fishing these waters out, not the locals. And it's kind of what's sad, of course, that they're stealing resources, but it's a real problem for the world. It's also evident that these exclusive economic zones cover so much of the North, Central, and South Pacific that they interlock to have a legal control, if you will, of an area far, far larger than the entire United States, including Alaska. I mean, this is, I wish I could overlay the United States in real size on these maps, but I think you could fit 2 or 3 United States in complete. I mean, this is a huge, huge area that we're talking about. And when China establishes mutual defense treaties with these nations, as they do, they are effectively attempting to control those economic zones to their economic and military benefit. And we have a model for this historically. Japan did that in World War II. So, you know, any appreciation for this map immediately explains why General Douglas MacArthur was forced to engage in that famous island hopping campaign back in World War II. His access to the far Pacific, most specifically the South China Sea, the Philippines, and Australia, were limited by the Japanese control of the economic zones. Now, I have a pointer here I'm going to grab real quick. Let's see, is it going to show? Does it show up on the screen? No, it doesn't. All right, I'm going to say, maybe, Professor Tidwell, maybe you could point out for me. The Marshalls, Micronesia, and Palau, this is a line. Right through there. And what they do is that Douglas MacArthur called that the Corridor of Freedom. That was his access to the Philippines, Australia, and the South China Sea. And that was incredibly valuable to control those areas. And in fact, those 3 nations, uncoincidentally, make up what we call the Compact of Freely Associated States to this day. We have a special relationship with those 3 nations. And the special relationship is this. We will provide for their defense completely. It's on us. In return for free transit across those waters. And that's actually a pretty good deal. And Douglas MacArthur appreciated that back in the 40s. And so I think it's remarkable to reflect on how many people fought and lost their lives for that corridor back in World War II. So I'm not going to name all the nations out here, and it's kind of a laundry list of nations, but there are a lot of really exciting, beautiful places out there. I had the chance, the Army sent me over the years, to do medical missions in various nations, certainly the territories, certainly the COFA nations, but also some of the others. We did medical missions there. We brought their patients, if the level of care we needed was that complex, we'd bring them back to Honolulu and treat them there. Yeah, nothing really can be understood about the economics and geopolitical importance of these interests without remembering the proximate presence of a lot of other big international players, to wit, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, and of course the Philippines. Not to mention, by the way, the critical connections again to the Pacific that the Indian Ocean nations share. And it's worth saying here, remember that India has become more and more part of our geopolitical considerations. It is the largest and youngest democracy in the world. And as such should be a major part of your generation's thinking. Wasn't probably enough of my generation's thinking. Of course, this audience knows that the South China Sea is a highly contested area with increasingly violent incursions, largely by the People's Republic of China, growing in frequency over the last several years. They have seized atolls and reefs that have been recognized for many years as parts of other sovereign nations and militarized as outposts for the purpose of denying access to sea and air transit. That's why they're there. It's not because there's farming is that good or the view is that good. This behavior flies directly in the face of the rules-based order of sovereign nations. It's recognized by the United Nations and, frankly, all the other countries in the world except for a handful. This is an international system that has been preeminent in the post-war years, the years that we tend to call the Pax Americana. And this amounts, again, to a hostile taking of territory in a hegemonic and imperialistic fashion. And various historical scenarios have been advanced by the People's Republic of China to justify these takings, but none of them withstand close scrutiny. Sooner or later, the nations of the world are going to have to confront this imperialism, or they're going to suffer another world war, driven by imperialism. The Indo-Pacific is and will continue to be a region of great importance to all of us in the near and far future. Literally 85% of the world's shipping goes somewhere through here. And that is an enormous amount of world trade. The U.S. does have special relationships and treaty obligations in the Pacific. We also must observe and defend from the People's Republic of China's depredations. Therefore, it behooves us all to ensure that these waters remain open and safe to navigation. About 20 years ago, our State Department, I think Amada thinks I'm being generous here, it was before 20 years ago. We'll say 20 years ago, our State Department sort of started drawing down its operations in the Indo-Pacific, in the Pacific Island nations, and became over-reliant on the influence of the Australians and the Kiwis and Japan. And our absence in those islands has been felt. And Amada and I felt that when we were out there last fall. Travel to and from these islands to America has become much more difficult, much more expensive. Visas for U.S. entry are much more difficult, and educational exchanges from those island nations to the U.S. have largely dried up. Entirely unsurprisingly, China filled in. Very gradually, recently, our State Department has been returning a presence to the Pacific Island nations. I would argue too gradually. Everybody's impatient for these things, but I think that I'm right. Here I also want to remind all Americans, not just you guys, help me get the word out. The United States is, in fact, a Pacific nation. People lose sight of that fact. Our territory extends far beyond Alaska and Hawaii. I know you know about the American territories in the far Pacific, Guam, the Marianas Islands, and of course American Samoa. But there's a lot of defense, security, and trade interests out here. And I will tell you, as a former Army surgeon stationed there, I witnessed the critical nature of the partnerships that we had there and the close bonds that it formed when we simply providing health care. I mean, that doesn't sound like such a difficult thing. We do that. We do it willingly. We send, I don't know how many medical missions to Haiti, Central America, South America, Africa, every year. I would like us to show a little love to the Pacific Island nations. And by the way, I don't see any medical missionaries just glancing out here, but if you do try to go to the Pacific Island nations, I guarantee you'll find a very, very warm, hospitable welcome and reception and a great deal of gratitude. The role America has in healthcare diplomacy, and that's what I'm calling this, healthcare diplomacy, can manifest as humanitarian delivery of care, education, healthcare education, medical education, ongoing cooperation, and infrastructure investment or actual building healthcare types. So, they just love to see our hospital ships. The Mercy goes out to the Pacific. The Hope goes in the Atlantic. They love that when we send it. Usually it's after a disaster. We don't use those enough. And they're wonderful. The hospital ships I've worked on, amazing places. A lot of capability on those ships. If we have a continuing demonstration of our commitment to the Pacific nations in their healthcare interests, we can counter a lot of the Chinese Communist Party's malign influences in that region. The islanders, almost to a person, repose great faith in Western medicine, and they're genuinely grateful. And I've witnessed this time and time again. This year, Congress has given special priority to the Pacific Islands and the freely associated states. We've passed several legislative items that benefit specifically that region. And as part of the 2024 Consolidated Appropriations Act, the House successfully renewed a treaty called the Compacts of Free Association through the fiscal year of 2043. So 20-year renewal. This renewal approves and incorporates by reference agreements signed between the nations. Again, that's the Republic of Palau, Federated Micronesia, States of Micronesia, and the Marshalls. All of the agreements we had before, and there is, in fact, some grants associated with that over the course of those 20 years. And it's a very reasonable thing to do. And I have to say, by the way, a major part of American aid to the Pacific, $232 million last year alone, went to islands in the Pacific region. So that's a major part. COFA Title II authorizes U.S. economic assistance, which expired at the end of fiscal year 23 for the Marshall Islands and Micronesia and was set to expire for Palau at the end of 24. We've taken care of all that. It's all renewed at this point. The agreement obligates us for their defense. Again, that's important to remember. But it also grants us freedom of transit across their economic zones. And never forget the corridor of freedom. The U.S. Department of Interior funds and administers this economic assistance in the form of grants and also through mandatory and permanent appropriations that have been in place since the compact was first adopted in 1986. And the freely associated states are eligible for some other American agency standard grants, and we encourage them and help them in that process. I was proud to support the renewal of the COFA agreements. It demonstrates to our allies throughout the Indo-Pacific region a commitment to this region, something we need to do. And it also helps them remain resilient and better able to resist the malign influences of China, frankly, in the region. The U.S. House of Representatives performed its duty by performing that fiscal year 25 appropriations obligation to the islands. Now it's up to the Senate. All right, that's where good bills go to die. So we never miss a chance to take a dig at the Senate. Right? In June, the House passed the 25 National Defense Authorization Act, including several amendments which I sponsored that were pertaining to the island nations and the freely associated states specifically. And the State Department appropriation for 25 also passed, allowed appropriations for some $175 million in addition, over and above the COFA compact, to the Pacific Island nations. By the way, I want to say this is not just a story of America's presence in the Indo-Pacific. I also sit on the Parliament of NATO, the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO is proper term, and I attended the spring session in Sofia, Bulgaria, and I did the annual report on economics and defense, and I share the title of my report: Building a Values-Based Transatlantic Economic and Strategic Partnership with the Indo-Pacific. Now, remember, North Atlantic Treaty Organization stands for North Atlantic, right? And just a few years ago, I was also sitting on that body, any mention of the Indo-Pacific would be generally shouted down, met with objections from across different countries in Europe, that, you know, that's China, that's the Indo-Pacific, that's you guys, it's not us in NATO. This year, I did that report, not one single objection, nobody, not one nation, not one voice spoke against that. And following my presentation, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, stood up and endorsed two principal ideas for 2025 in NATO: win in Ukraine, and we have to have better relations with the Indo-Pacific. That was his parting, because this is his final year. That's his parting message to the world, all the free Western world allies, and there are now 32 in NATO. So it's really fascinating to me that NATO has just in a few years done this major shift where they realize that they have genuine, pressing, immediate geopolitical and geostrategic interests in the Indo-Pacific. So everybody's got to raise their gaze up and look around a little bit more, and we can't be quite so parochial in our approach. So we will actually finalize that report in November in Montreal. I just wanted to emphasize again, it was shocking to me that we didn't have to fight any objections on that. That was a sea change in our parliamentary assembly. Let's see, just when I said that, I was also proud to support the Pacific Partnership Act, which overwhelmingly passed the U.S. House. This act requires annually updated strategies for Pacific partnership with the U.S., developed in consultation with the Pacific Island nations, set specific goals for U.S. engagement with these nations, assesses threats and pressures in the region, and requires a plan to address those threats. And I have full faith, actually, that our Department of Defense is going to enthusiastically pursue that. They asked us to help them make that a primary mission for them. The bill further extends diplomatic courtesies to the Pacific Islands Forum, which is the primary multilateral organization of the Pacific Island nations, and codifies an increased collaboration with U.S. efforts in the Pacific and our ally partner nations, the NATO alliance, throughout the region. And by the way, other allies in the Indo-Pacific. India comes to mind. In fact, by name included in that was Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore, and India. Next, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about healthcare diplomacy. For generations, the United States has been a willing and enthusiastic partner in healthcare diplomacy. And I would add that there seems to be some favored recipients of this healthcare diplomacy if you look around the world. Some countries seem to get it again and again and again, and others just don't seem to get any love at all. To me, it seems like the most natural form of diplomacy, healthcare. I mean, who doesn't want to help people? And I promise you they're grateful. I mean, this is a really easy way to make friends. And we do healthcare pretty well. Today, the sentiments towards the United States provided healthcare remains as strong as ever. We ascertained that again last fall. But we are still perceived by the island nations as far, far less engaged than we have been in the past. We can and have to provide better support and leadership in that area. Healthcare in the Pacific obviously presents some challenges, and there's not just distance and logistics, also finances, and honestly, they don't have the educational support system out there that they would wish to have. We can work on these things together, and actually, Georgetown would be a great place to partner with. I'm just thinking. And future, I think, can be readily envisioned with hub facilities that are backed up by educational exchanges and telehealth. And everybody believes that artificial intelligence is going to play a major role in disseminating higher quality medical decision making throughout the world. And I'm certain of it myself. I think it's the low-hanging fruit of artificial intelligence. I want to stress again the health education. This is an area of maximal benefit, minimal expense. There's nothing like bringing somebody from one of these island nations back to America, give them a health care education, whatever it is, nursing, x-ray tech, surgeon, whatever, and let them return home. They will multiply the effort enormously, and they also maintain contact with us and make us more aware, frankly, of parts of the world. I hate to say that we tend to forget. They're beautiful islands, I believe me. They're just gorgeous. But it's a long ways away, and it is hard sometimes for people to picture themselves going quite that far. However, China has enthusiastically embraced healthcare education. They literally educate hundreds of Pacific Islander nationals every year in China. Hundreds every year. And they're making an effort. And if you don't show up, you're not in the game. So China has really taken kind of a lead on us in a lot of these ways. I promise you, if we put 1/2 of the effort into the Pacific Island nations that we put into Haiti, we would see far greater both diplomatic and, frankly, medical returns. Now, I also sit on the Artificial Intelligence Task Force, and I think we should be promulgating that through the telehealth and, frankly, in the educational opportunities there. And we could talk about that as much as you like, but it's a huge workforce multiplier to have that kind of intelligence and algorithms at your fingertips, even if it's just reminding a doctor things he doesn't think about. So there's a lot of good to be had there. And on a final note, as we think about the educational infrastructure, we have to add access to broadband, the internet, right? So China reliably wants to monetize every relationship with every client nation. All right, so what they want to do is to drag fiber optic cable from China to these island nations, set up their own Wi-Fi towers, and sell that stuff to the locals, and at whatever price they think they can get away with. Now, that makes them dependent on China, but it's also the single most expensive way to do broadband in the islands. I mean, we have wonderful satellite technology for broadband these days, and it really, really is quick and easy set up. Now, I proved this to myself. I went out and bought one of those Starlink kits, $400, set it up at my house. I can live stream any movie I want right next to my Comcast. Got them both. Just try taking it away from the kids. This is easy and it's instant, and you can do that just as easily in Guadalcanal as you can do it in Panama City, Florida. I mean, it's just that easy. A $400 kit and a little bit of power, and you're up and running with Wi-Fi. And typically, a typical household node will serve 12 other nodes. This is and much cheaper, much faster, and the Chinese are hooking them on fiber, and that's our fault. We aren't making that easy for multiple satellite broadband providers to be providing in the islands, and there are multiple. When they come through my office, say, "Why can't we get on the list?" I'm trying. We need to do that. It will be a major recommendation from the select CCP committee to the telecom committee, which ironically I also sit on. So I have a feeling it'll land in soft. So, the other thing to say about fiber is when they make them dependent on fiber optic cables, this is a very, very vulnerable way to have a broadband connection. And Finland found that out after they joined NATO. The very next week, a Chinese ship accidentally dragged an anchor 110 miles across the bottom and disrupted 3 fiber optic cables to Helsinki. The next week. And they did that just by dragging an anchor on a boat. It's really easy to disrupt fiber optic cable connections. And now we have pretty good repair services in Europe. It's not so good out there in the Pacific. So that's very, very vulnerable. Every war game I've ever seen in the Pacific, all the fiber optic subsea channels go away day one. Everybody's isolated. So again, the island nation is a perfect situation for satellite-based Wi-Fi in terms of reliability, resilience. We know how quickly you can put satellites back up if they're compromised. It's just not that hard. Ukraine has showed us what you can do, by the way, with that kind of satellite-based communication system. With that, I think I'll probably close my comments. I want to thank all of you for your gracious invitation to speak here tonight. Thank you for choosing to study this unique and critically important and, quite frankly, beautiful area of the world. I urge you to carry on the good work. I hope you'll go visit regularly out there. It will be rewarding, and bring your camera because it's beautiful. And what I thought I'd do next is sort of take some comments and questions from the audience. And I'm going to ask, if I can, Professor Tidwell to moderate for us, if you would do that. And then I want to ask a couple of colleagues to come forward and help me, because there's more expertise here than I have on the Pacific Island nations, and none better than Representative Rattlewagon herself, who is outstanding. And I mean, when I traveled the islands with her, I have to say, I felt like I was in attendance with royalty. I mean, but she didn't make me carry her bag or anything. So please, Amada, come forward. And I think Dr. Natuzzi is Dr. Natuzzi. We are so hiding back in the back. Come on, get your light out from under the bushel. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Eileen Natuzzi real quick. Have a seat, Amada. Do you know this crowd pretty well, Eileen? So look, coming forward, you're going to be under fire too. So Dr. Natuzzi is a general surgeon who's decided to spend her and I call semi-retirement because she works pretty darn hard, out there in the Pacific, doing healthcare diplomacy on her own. She's not working for the State Department, right? They're not paying you. They're not even helping you with the cost. Yes, that's funny. Or as we say, USAID. But she actually has done a great deal of work with medical education in the, I think the Solomon Islands principally, but other places as well.
Yeah, we actually work in 12 different Pacific Island countries training them to do endoscopy.
So this is where the rubber hits the road. Here's somebody who's actually doing this healthcare diplomacy that I'm advertising and talking about. My own experience as a healthcare diplomat goes back, well, let's just say not many people in this audience would remember those days. But, but she's current, I mean, very current. And in fact, we ran into her in the Solomon Islands last fall. And she's busy working hard down there. She knows the people on the ground. She knows their needs. And so she can talk with authority about healthcare diplomacy and healthcare needs. And I actually have genuinely enjoyed the time to get to pick her brain and get to know her. It kind of refreshed my interest, frankly, in this kind of effort. Peter, you want to be on call for questions? Peter is an incredible diplomat in the Pacific area for the last, how many decades now? Oh, well, I can't say that. He's young, like I'm young, and really an incredibly knowledgeable person about all the Pacific Island and policy, by the way, from the highest levels of our government, the Australian government, the New Zealand government, and actually the governments of the island nations out there, I think with some special emphasis on the COFA nations as well. Peter has more diplomatic experience out there than maybe anybody but Ahmad. I'll let the two of you arm wrestle over that. So I got a lot of expertise and experience here for you, and I'm going to just kind of ride the wave here. Professor, will you start the questions?
Well, let me open the floor for questions, and I've got a hand, gentleman in the, yep, and I'll pass that to whoever answers it. You better ask your question, I think.
Okay.
Stand up and tell. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank Congressman for being here. I'm Blaze. I'm a Ramsey Scholar from Australia.
Ah, there we go. All right.
Yeah, I'm studying the Master of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. I've just started. So my question, in terms of the healthcare diplomacy, I feel like a big area that the U.S. would have an advantage over China is religion. I mean, it's a very deeply religious community that China certainly doesn't have the edge on. Can you
Guess
speak
not.
to any of the diplomatic efforts through churches that might be occurring in the region?
So that's a cultural question, not a medical one. Maybe Amada.
It is a very Christian area, so what was your question?
More engagement.
Yeah, is it used? Is Christian church engagement used diplomatically? Is it happening?
I don't think they're doing as much as they should, but it exists out in the Pacific Island nations. Now, in terms of the larger countries such as Australia, the United States, are they looking at this? I don't think they really are, and it's sort of low-hanging fruit in a way.
Yeah. So, and I just want to add to that. I mean, see, a lot of times you see medical missions sponsored through churches, and so there's a natural connection here. And I'll bet Dr. Natuzzi.
Yeah, I think when I first started working in Solomon Islands, the best way to get around the islands and get to know people was to work through the churches. And so I think your question is a really pertinent one. And yes, on the ground, there are people who are Solomon Islanders, Samoans, who are concerned about that China is not a Christian country. So the religious sentiment is really deep, as Congressman Redewagen said. And it is a mechanism to work. But what I would say is we need to go big. Instead of NGOs working through churches, we need to go with Australia, New Zealand, the US, Japan, coming together and saying, we're going to tackle this problem once and for all. If we do it through the churches, more power to us. But, your question is a really pertinent one, and I think that faith does come into play in the Pacific Islands in their relationship with China. It's a little bit tenuous because of that.
Peter Watson, do you have a large? So she touched on the larger diplomatic. We need to come together with our allies, like great Five Eye types, and surely we can cooperate in somewhat meaningful way.
Just to touch on the religious piece here, I've come across a number of Pacific Island leaders who are very concerned, frankly, about the insinuation of the PRC into their cultural systems. They interrupt and interfere with the internal governance of the places that they're in. We've seen that most recently, frankly, in the Solomons. We've had senior representatives here from the Solomons who are profoundly religious and deeply concerned about the the intrusions into their world, into their life, into their beliefs, into their cultural affiliations, with their tribal references. So this is a very profound difference and point of reference. Because just to your point, Congressman, what we are looking at here, and the telecommunications one is just a very important one, because what comes also...
That's easy.
Well, you see, here's the interesting thing, though.
The work's been done for us. All we have to do is just encourage.
It is, but there's some parochial legacy issues to deal with in Pacific Islands, too, if I may, on that. For example, telecommunications are your embedded legacy wire systems, and with those systems come legacy interests of the post office and telegraphs. So they are pushing back against
Oh my gosh.
the ability of their subscribers to, in fact, get the Starlink and the other services. So it's an interesting tension that is actually in their own systems. But
Imagine that, the old fighting the new.
but that's sort of a little bit unsurprising, but it's disturbing at the same time, because I'll just reference Palau, but we've seen it in Guam as well, because there are significant intrusions of the CCP
Yes.
into our telecommunications systems. They've taken down military systems in Guam. They've significant intrusions into Palau. So a concerted effort, to your question, to your point, is really critical with Australia, with New Zealand, ability to inform some of these risks and to have action plans. And if we want, we can touch on a little bit with PNG and Bougainville too, if we have a moment.
Yeah, I mean, will you make a comment about PNG?
In terms of telecommunications side? Or
That's the
General.
question on the floor.
Yeah, well, one comment I want to make about undersea cables. To me, one of the biggest risks is hacking of undersea cables.
Yeah.
And the ability to get intelligence through those. It's pretty, my background's in telecommunications and satellite, and it's pretty simple to hack those cables. You don't even have to cut them. You just have to drop a transducer beside the cable, and you can interpret the signals going through the cables. And I think that is an ongoing problem with undersea cables. And I believe it's happened a few times already that we know about.
Yes. In Guam. And Guam is America. Remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As far as the Bougainville PNG situation, I think we're making some progress there, and we'll talk about that later.
I'd love to hear more from you.
Yeah, it's a situation which came about.
Why don't you stand up?
I'm sorry.
Why don't you stand up?
Okay.
Yeah,
It's a
face it.
situation that came about as a result of the original independence of New Guinea from Australia. Bougainville was part of New Guinea in those days. When PNG became independent, the Bougainvilleans wanted to separate again because they were really part of the Solomon Islands, North Solomon Islands, and they weren't allowed to, by Australia in this case. And ever since then, there's been some animosity, which ended up creating a war. They call it the crisis, and I think Neal mentioned 20,000 people died during that over some mining rights and the operation of one of the largest, or the largest copper gold mine in the world at the time. Since then, the solution to that problem was help from New Zealand, Australia, and some of the other Pacific islands. There were, I think, 8 Pacific islands, including Australia and New Zealand, who managed to send peacekeeping forces to the area and settled it with the Bougainville Peace Agreement in 2001. Under that agreement, by 2019, they had to have a referendum, which they had. The Bougainvilleans voted, I think from memory, it was 98.7% in favor of independence, but negotiations on that have been going on now for 4 or 5 years, and they haven't made much progress. The recent progress, however, is 2 things. One, the no confidence motion was defeated in the PNG Parliament, which kept Marape in power because he was threatened by the opposition parties in PNG. And secondly, the appointment, which was aided very much by both New Zealand and Australia, to get a mediator into those discussions, which both parties, Marape and Tarama in Bougainville, supported. We're now just waiting for the final details of that and try and understand how that independence can occur, what form it would take, whether it's a free association or some other form of relationship. But it's powerful because Bougainville sits right north of the Solomon Islands. And if we can resolve that problem, it sends a signal to the Solomon Islands and further south to Vanuatu, how people can work together to get a solution. And I think we're on our way to do it. I'd like to say, from my perspective, it can be done in 6 to 12 months, I hope. But I think the involvement of New Zealand and Australia working together on that has been really important. Also, the tacit support from the US government and that has been very helpful. But what we'd like to see is these three groups, and perhaps Japan, as people have mentioned, working together on various projects like this throughout the Pacific. And I think this sort of grouping, this sort of partnership is well looked at in most of those island nations throughout the Pacific. And I think it gives us a real advantage in a geopolitical sense against people like China coming into the area. And one thing I'd just like to mention while we're talking about this, it's slightly off the topic, but fisheries is a big thing in the region.
Yes.
A lot of the incomes of those island nations are dependent on fisheries and the revenues they get from license fees. I did some work on this about a year or so ago, and then in discussions more recently with the White House here, everyone recognized the importance. The question is, how do we get rid of the illegal fishing in these areas? How do we do things that make sense? And I think that probably and this is at the top of my head, we can make about 15 countries in that region, 15 island nations in that region, self-sufficient if we can sort out illegal fishing and support them in getting the full revenues they deserve from fisheries. So I think it's a crucial thing. I know it's a resources issue. I've had discussions in Canberra and here in DC about what resources are available to support the island nations, to Neal's point. But I think it'll have a dramatic impact on all those nations in the Pacific.
So thank you for that. And I want to say that your one simple question, I hope you saw how it interconnected with so very, very many different issues. I mean, and that's everything in the Pacific. It's always like that in the Pacific. You know, you pluck one thread out and boy, the whole ball of wax or yarn, just comes right falling behind it. And so everything is connected, interconnected, from culture to healthcare to science to defense and all those things. It's a very, very, actually it's a wonderful culture in a lot of ways to have that connectedness. But we're kind of, United States is kind of absent at the table. And I think we're making headway. Again, I feel that strongly. And Japan is showing up more. But Australia and New Zealand have been there since the war. They've been working every day since then. We've kind of been surfing on their efforts. Can you find another question like that one to get this thing started? Yeah, go ahead. Stand up.
Hi, I'm Alan Jung. I'm an undergraduate student here at Georgetown, and I'm from South Korea.
Ah.
So the topic of this discussion segues into what I really have been striving to ask. So my question is, what are the roles of the U.S., of the like-minded partners of the United States, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan in safeguarding the peace, the free and open in the Pacific, specifically in this region? Thank you very much.
So instead of me just taking a shot at this answer, we as I say, we have some real expertise in the audience, and I'm going to ask somebody else to answer your question. But it's going to be Fred Radewagen, who just happens to be related to him. Fred, I hope you listened to his question. But Fred is a international journalist in the Pacific, and reports on all of these areas, all of these dealings internationally with, and by the way, domestically amongst these nations, and probably has much more accurate view of the answer to your question than I do.
Would you state it again exactly what you're asking?
So, what are the approaches that the U.S., like the like-minded partners of the United States, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and what should we do in order to support the U.S.-led free and open Indo-Pacific, despite the fact that we're heavily economically dependent
Great
on
question. What should we be doing to facilitate what a lot of our allies are already trying to do? Stand up and let them see you, Freddie.
Well, what we need to do as a country is to be doing a lot more networking. We have these various alliances, and Korea, South Korea being part of it. My major concern right now is that we're going to be having a new administration in January, and there are three national security areas that we need to worry about. One is going to be continuing problem with Ukraine and Russia. The second one is the Middle East, and the third is going to be Indo-Pacific. And the focus tends to be on Taiwan, because it's the Taiwan-China, and we worry that Xi is going to use the change of administrations to try to take over Taiwan or do something with Taiwan. So we need to continue to be aware of that and make sure that the alliances we have include the Pacific Islands. The main thing, we've got to make sure that they're always part of it.
I was really heartened that NATO woke up to that.
Yes.
Because that is a sea change in NATO. And
Absolutely.
so if NATO is waking up to the fact that the Indo-Pacific, the Pacific Island nations are important, it's time. That's not an early warning system. That's a late warning system.
And specifically what South Korea can do is to increase its commercial activity in the Pacific Islands and air traffic. You've got to get around from island
Shipbuilding.
to island, and air service is poor throughout much of the region. So to the extent that the Korean government can subsidize the airlines going there to make sure that you are connecting all the time. And right now I'm representing the governor of the Northern Mariana Islands, and I know he's been to Seoul and begging for additional service from Seoul into Saipan, which is the capital of the Northern Marianas. So I think that's what they need to do. Fisheries, yes, fisheries, and air service and commercial activity. That's what South Korea can do.
Fisheries are something Americans don't think about all the time because, frankly, our fisheries aren't being, looted by China. That's because we make sure they don't do it. When we think about fisheries, we think we're in trouble with the game warden. When they think about fisheries, they're in trouble with China. I mean, that's a logarithmically different risk, big time. Other question.
One more question. Yes, the lady here.
So I'm Sarah Grace. I'm a junior in the SFS, and my question sort of relates to, you mentioned infrastructure and healthcare diplomacy, and I was wondering what your views on those types of diplomacy in regard to multilateral development banks would be. Specifically, China wins like a lot of procurements in the Asian Development Bank and also the World Bank, and so my question is, how should the U.S. in concert with other like-minded allies really aim to get more like businesses bidding on procurements in the Pacific?
Investment in infrastructure leads to infrastructure, and we actually have an expert on the subject, former chairman of the International Trade Commission. That's right. Up, 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 up. You're on the spot again, Peter.
Thank you. You've really put your finger on, I think, one of the most important elements of how we in the Western world can, in fact, support economic self-determination in these countries, because that's what we do. We do it well when we actually focus on it and we put resources on it. I spent some time at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and frankly, we didn't put much focus on the Pacific Islands as much as is coming on now. But there's a range of United States programs that are starting to actually be engaged out there. The Trade Development Agency, TDA, the DFC is becoming, Development Finance Corporation is becoming increasingly interested there. But they're coming from a slow start, frankly.
You're kind. How diplomatic.
But to your point, and this is really, really quite critical, what these countries and these individuals, more than anything else, they want economic self-determination for them and their children and their communities, families and countries. And this economic sovereignty is one of the most important characteristics and elements that we share as humans. But, and I don't want this just to be a sort of a CCP thing, but that's exactly the opposite of what the solutions that China is prescribing for these places. They are prescribing demand-driven, their systems are driven without reference to the inclusion of the business community, of populations in villages, in countries where people can get a stake in their own economic development. And that is the dividing line between the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. And I may just touch on for a moment, very, very pleased to see that President Biden brought together Japan, Korea, at a Camp David, small but well, we've just had a Quad meeting recently, of course, in Delaware. So increasingly, we're starting to develop our focus on economic self-determination, and these solutions have to get a lot more support from these countries because that is where we meet the needs of the people on the ground that will not be met by China.
I actually have to add something here. As a physician who's been working in the Solomon Islands for 20 years, the only solution isn't economic, and I'll tell you why. The McKinsey report actually says for every dollar invested in healthcare, you get $2 to $4 back economically in a healthy workforce, in a workforce that lives longer. And one of the biggest problems in the Pacific is premature mortality. Mm-hmm. A 24-year-old shouldn't be dying from rheumatic heart disease, but they do because it's a significant problem in American Samoa, in Solomon Islands, throughout the Pacific. So I think that we can't just take a forge ahead financially and economically. And even the World Bank gets it now. They just had a side meeting during the PIF meeting that said, health is a crisis in the Pacific Islands and we need to address it. So I think it has to be a combination of both. It's a cross-sectoral problem. And so I think that as you guys are going through your education, I want you to sort of think of the sector of health and how it interplays with the development of a country as well, too.
Thank you. Professor Tidwell, could you advance the slide? The boss. Hey, Chief, can you advance the slide? I want to show them one more thing here. So this is the same economic zones. Now, they're colored sort of by friendly alliance nations. And, of course, you can see a lot of blue. That's the United States. A lot of sort of the orange. That's the Australian. Greens, New Zealand. And the purple is France. It looks pretty friendly, right? Show them the next slide. Okay, that's the alliances today in the economic zones, all right? The red is Chinese alliances in those islands, often mutual defense alliances, certainly diplomatic alliances. This represents a sea change over 15 to 20 years. And by the way, some of the island nations that are colored green on this map, it's out of date. They're red already, all right? So China has established the old island, first and second island chain defense that Japan had during World War II. So we're looking at a fairly hostile situation if we want to get back to the far Pacific, the South China Sea. And by the way, just go down and visit our friends in Australia and New Zealand could get difficult. You know, this is a dire situation that snuck up on Americans while we were asleep at the wheel. It's not too late. They still love us out there. We got to show them some love back. I thank this audience. By the way, I hope you appreciate, that all the brains in this group are not me. I mean, to be honest with Amada and all of her retinue of friends from the Pacific Islands, I mean, these are the people who taught me about the Pacific Islands, and I can't say enough good about that. So you have some great assets you can draw on, and I'm very grateful to all of you for the attention and honestly, for the insights you've shared. Professor Tidwell?
Thank you so much, Congressman. Would you please join me in thanking Congressman Dunn for his wonderful work?
Thank you. We did it. Fred, hey, thank you.